Okay. All right. So we are now recording. And so that's what God was all about. God was able to bring the rain. God was able to protect us. God was able to do all kinds of things to make sure that we were okay. Okay. Meaning, in the ancient world. That's what God was in 5 minutes. I know there's a lot to unpack there, but we'll get there. And I'm going to save one more detail about God for a little bit. Israel, right? In ancient times, so Israel, first of all, is a name that is given to the patriarch Jacob. Yaakov, Jacob wrestles with an angel, and they have, for lack of a better term, a wrestling match all night long. Jacob wins the fight, and the angel says, "It's morning, I have to go." And Jacob says, "I won't let you go until you bless me." And the angel says, from this point forward, your name shall no longer be Jacob, it shall be Yisrael, because you have striven with divine beings and won. So Jacob basically wins the match and gets the name Yisrael. Yisrael, Israel, means to struggle with God. It also, scholars also say it means God will fight for us. We can get into the grammar another time. But that is what those two ideas, that we are struggling with God and that God is struggling on our behalf, that's what it means to be a part of Yisrael, a part of Israel. Now, what does Israel mean? A couple of things. Israel is a place, right? There's the place, the country of Israel, the modern state of Israel. There was an ancient kingdom of Israel. And we today are part of the people of Israel, literally the children of Jacob, the Bnei Israel, the children of that patriarch. That's where we get that name. And so in ancient times, right, if you're living in Israel, that's a big part of your existence. It's a part of your identity. It's a part of who you are, both the land and its people. So we've got God and we've got Israel out of the way. And for the rest of the night, we are going to talk about Torah. We're going to talk about this idea of Torah. So I want to pause here and ask you, when I say the word Torah, what comes to mind? Does it ring a bell for you? And as best as I can, I want to try and foster a little bit of conversation. I know it's tough. The first person who's going to come up with the, their first comment, I don't know who it will be, but be brave. Go get them. What does it mean? What does Torah mean to you? What is that Torah thing?
The 5 books of Moses.
Okay, thank you. So we've got an answer. What is Torah? It's the 5 books of Moses. Great and interesting point too, because suddenly these books are attributed to someone, this guy named Moses, who we learn about in the 5 books of Moses. His story is there. And so that is a wonderful and important answer. What else? Maybe that does sum it up. It's a good one.
The scrolls. Or scroll.
Okay, beautiful. So a Torah, right? So we can talk about the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, and also there is, and I will pull up some images since we are here on the internet. Torah can be this. Hang on one second. I just did a quick Google image search, okay? Here is not a bad one to look at, right? This is a Torah scroll. I will tell you that in person, right, when we're doing this class live, what I would do is take you into the sanctuary and we would open up the Ark and we would show you the Torah. A little bit later tonight, I will take you on a virtual tour, so to speak, of a sanctuary. And kind of explain what all of that is. But yes, this is the Torah. And I'll tell you, I'll stop my screen share, and I'll tell you a little bit about the physical Torah. A Torah is a written document written on parchment. It's made of animal skin. It starts at the very beginning of the book of Genesis, In the beginning, God created, yada, yada, yada. And it ends at the very end of the book of Deuteronomy. All of that is written on parchment. It has to be done by hand. In order for it to be a kosher Torah scroll, it has to be done by hand. It is done only with all natural materials. So literally a quill for the writing implement. It has to be all natural ink. The wood on the sides has to be all natural, and it has to be completely, the paper, like nothing synthetic, even down to the stitches that sew the parchment together has to be the sinew of an animal. It cannot be just any old thread. That makes a Torah, and it is one of the most, Judaism is all about, we don't worship objects, right? We worship the God of the universe, but that's about as close as you can get to an item, an object being holy. John.
I was reading in some of the stuff that the ancillary stuff that you said, talking about the making of the Torah, and it talked about the thread being made from the veins of an animal. But I was actually, what do they use as the needle? Because clearly they're not using steel or iron. So
Fantastic. So actually, and John, do you want to expand on why not steel or iron?
Weapons are used in weapons of war.
Okay, fantastic. So there is also a tradition, and it goes back to the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. You were not allowed to bring metals of war near the altar. The Torah and the study of Torah is very much in place of, we'll talk about that eventually too, in place of sacrifices. And so because of that, when we open up the Torah, it's almost as if the new offering up to God is not an animal. Thank goodness. I would have a much more messy job. But instead, it is an offering up of words, right? And it's an offering up of these holy words that are in there. And so what happens, right? We adopt a lot of the same laws, one of which is no instrument or a material of war is allowed to be near the altar or near the Torah. So that's why anytime you will see a yad, let me share my screen again. And a yad is the Hebrew word for hand. And you will see, hang on one second, Torah. Yeah, share. So you will see here, this long hand or pointer, okay, and it actually does have a little, it's oftentimes a little, it looks like a hand at the end. That's what you use to point. You don't touch it with your hands. And all of those have to be made of natural materials and cannot be iron or steel or anything else. And so, sorry, going back to that question, John, I don't, off the top of my head, I do not know what it is exactly that they use, but the needle is not iron or steel. It certainly would be probably some sort of either sharp enough feather that they can, get through to do that, or something. But you're right. It's not, it would not be considered kosher if they're using materials that are materials of war. All right. Other questions about that? About the physical thing? There's a tradition that if you drop the Torah, you fast the community fasts for 40 days. This is our first introduction to the number 40 in Judaism. Welcome to the number 40. The number 40, I will translate it to mean the following: a long time. Okay, 40 days and 40 nights in the Noah story of how long he's on that ark. 40 years in the desert. 400 years in slavery in Egypt. Basically, the number 40 or 400 means a long time. Some people choose to take it literally, other people don't. Don't worry, if some of you are thinking like, oh, I really want to get into this, what happens if a Torah drops? There is a custom actually of a community compiling 40 days together. So someone might take a day or a half a day and all that. But all of that being said, which is like Jewish tradition of like heaven forbid, okay? The whole point being that thing, right? What are they trying to say? What are the rabbis, the ancient rabbis trying to say? That thing is holy. Don't drop it. Keep it close to you and keep it in a special place. That special place is the Ark. It's the Ark, for many of you might know, the Ark of the Covenant, right? There's a tradition that there was this special place where the actual tablets were held. You know, Indiana Jones might have been in search of this at one point or another. And today we have it. It basically looks like a big closet, but most synagogues in the world have an Aron Kodesh, a holy ark, where there are two doors that open up, and there is the Torah or Torahs, depending on how many the community has. I just threw a lot at you. I'm going to stop and ask for questions.
Jason, I remember, or maybe I don't remember, the ark actually has to face a particular direction. Is that correct? East or west or something?
So it's a custom. It's a custom for it. You know, if you have the luxury of building from scratch or setting up from scratch, it is traditional to put the ark in the direction of Jerusalem. So here in the United States, right, generally we face east to face Jerusalem. If you're in a synagogue in Johannesburg, you're facing north, right? And if you're up or wherever you are, right? That's what it is. By the way, Johannesburg is South Africa, right? I'm getting that right. That's all. Yeah. Just okay. All right. Sorry. It's been a long day. Okay. So anyway, so wherever you are, right, you're facing towards Jerusalem. Once you're in Israel, also it gets much tougher. Once you're in Israel, if you're depending on where you are for Shabbat that night, right, the ark will be facing a different way towards the Western Wall. So once you're in Israel, it's actually the holiest place is in Jerusalem. It's the Western Wall because that's where the temple, or right next to it, is where the temple once stood. Okay, so that's why the Torahs are housed in that direction. That being said, if the Torah is in a different place, the tradition is for prayer, you face the Torahs. You don't face east, you face the Torahs. And sometimes for certain prayers that we'll get into, you face Jerusalem always. Good question. All right. So I want to, here it is. I want to do our first Hebrew lesson. Mazel tov, which means congratulations. We are going to do some Hebrew together. This, my friends, is the Hebrew word Torah. What I'm going to do is put the English letters over the Hebrew, okay? And please stop me at any point if you need an explanation. This is the word Torah. By the way, actually, do I have any Hebrew readers in here that can tell me, is this coming out reverse or is this okay? Am I moving from right to left? We're good? Okay. All right. This is the word Torah, okay? And above it, in Hebrew, most letters are consonants, okay? The vowels are found above and below the consonants. So what you have here is the letter T. This is an O sound. It's a vowel. R, the resh is R, and the He is kind of there on the end for reasons we don't have to get into right now. Torah, okay? Hebrew is a Semitic language. And Semitic languages, meaning Arabic, Hebrew, And then in ancient times, Ugaritic and Akkadian. Just like saying those words because it makes me sound smart, but ultimately I can't read it. And they're precursors of Hebrew. All of those languages are based on a 3-letter root system, and the rest of the language kind of, and the words morph around those 3-letter roots. Okay, so this is boiled down to a 3-letter root: Yud, Resh, He. Okay, one day when some of you are inspired to go do a master's in Hebrew language, you'll be like, that's what he was talking about. But for what you have to know now, the Yud, this is a letter that actually, it disappears when this form is there. Don't worry about it. But the root is what and these are periods. It's just to show it's not a word. The root is Yud, Resh, He, which means in modern Hebrew, to shoot. Okay, like to shoot a gun. The root of Torah means to shoot. And the reason is because of how in ancient times education was done. You would have someone at the front of the room who knew a lot about whatever they were teaching, and they would shoot it at all of the students. Right? They would shoot out words and lessons and whatever else, and people took it in. That is the essence of what Torah means, is that we are shooting it out and giving it to other people. The Torah is shooting out knowledge all the time. Okay? That is what this is doing, what that word is doing when we talk about Torah. I know I can pick out, there are educators on this call, right? Which clearly today, that's not the best way to educate, even though actually I'm guilty of it right now. This has been lecture so far. But what I want to highlight is that it's kind of an interesting thing, and we'll continue to think about this as we go, right? If that's what Judaism was at the beginning, and we know that things have evolved and that we know we learn better in different styles, does Torah change as the generations change? And we'll talk about that. Is it, and this comes up in our politics today, right? Is our founding document a living and breathing document that changes, or is it set in stone? Right? That applies for the Constitution. It applies for us for class and for the Jewish people. So again, I'll stop there. Questions, comments? Also, and you're more than welcome to place comments in the chat if you would find that to be easier and better. There's one here. I'm just.
Well, Jason,
Okay.
I'm gonna jump in here. We've talked about Torah's, I guess I want to say almost in the construction sense, what the scroll is, the word itself, but it seems to me Torah as an experiential sort of thing really comes into the argument of what the heck is it all telling us, because it wouldn't be just an issue of, hey, we read this is the word of God, but really I think it comes down to what are we supposed to get out of these 5 books? What does this story tell us about who we are historically, and what we are supposed to be doing as we move forward with this? I mean, other than that, I'll be personally, I don't really care how it's put together. It's what's the meaning therein.
Okay. So, and by the way, and let me just clarify, when you're saying put together, do you mean like how a scroll is constructed, or do you mean?
Right, exactly.
Or do you mean
how the scroll is constructed? I mean, honestly, would it change what we're supposed to get out of it if they really did stitch it together with a steel needle? And in my mind, the answer is no. It isn't. The message is the message. The material, the vessel that delivers that message is a completely sort of different thing.
Great. Okay. So I think it's time to jump into what is this whole Torah thing anyway? Okay, I'm going to take us to a website that you should know about. It is a modern marvel of the Jewish world, and I will tell the story of Torah in two separate ways. Okay, but let me share my screen with you. I'm going to share this for two reasons. Actually, I'll explain in a moment. The first is to show you, I'm sorry, John, one more thing about the making of the scroll, because I just think it's cool, okay? And then I promise we'll get into the other stuff. All right, hang on one second. And, here we go. All right, so welcome to safaria.org. And this, what you are watching on top, if you can see that video, is actually, and this runs, I could get stuck here all day instead of searching for things. This is a scribe, a sofer or soferet. For many years, sofer being the masculine, for many, many years, for millennia, it was only men who were able to do this. In recent decades only, women have now started to learn how to be sofrot, which is the plural. They learn how to be scribes. This is a scribe putting the ink on the parchment of the Torah, okay? And I just think it's beautiful, so I wanted to start with that. But up on your left-hand corner is the little menu button here, okay? I'm gonna press that, and that takes us to the Safaria Library. This is a modern marvel of Jewish text and Jewish learning, okay? What you have here, and we're going to go through a lot of this today, what you have here is pretty much anything you could ever imagine with Jewish learning. I'm going to purposely, I can't even go any less, but let's focus on here right now, okay? This is under the headline of texts. This is the Tanakh. The Tanakh is not a word, it's an acronym. It is in Hebrew, it is three Hebrew letters that stand for Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. I'm going to click on this, and you will see, as John Beck said beautifully, what is the Torah? The 5 books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. But that's not the entire Hebrew Bible. It goes on into the prophets. Joshua, Judges, Samuel, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, Kings, you can read it for yourself. All the prophets of Israel. The writings, Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Song of Songs, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, yada, yada. And that is it. I'm going to stop it there. There's more to see, but we're going to stop it there. That is the Tanakh, okay? I'm going to stop my share. I'm going to tell you 2 stories about how the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, developed. Story number 1. Once upon a time, the ancient Israelites were slaves in Egypt. They left, and by the hand of God were carried out into the desert, where they dwelt for 40 years. During that time, they arrived at a mountain called Mount Sinai. A certain gentleman by the name of Moses climbed that mountain and kind of went up and down a few times. And on that mountain was given the Torah. Moses came down and gave it to the Jewish people. And I'm going to now show you from Safaria a text that is from Pirkei Avot, which means the ethics of the fathers. This is not biblical. This is not part of the Hebrew Bible, but it is important for you to see. Share. And they even have a function of making the font size larger, so we can really dig in. And what's beautiful about it also, for you Hebrew lovers, it's in Hebrew and English. So it's from the Pirkei Avot, means ethics of the fathers, which is from the Talmud. I'll get into that, God willing, by the end of tonight. And here's how the book starts. Moses received the Torah at Sinai and transmitted it to Joshua, Joshua to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets to the men of the great assembly. They said three things: be patient in the administration of justice, raise many disciples, and make a fence around the Torah. The end. It's been great having class with you tonight. We'll see. I'm just kidding. Okay. So that's story one, okay, of how the Torah came to be. Let me tell you another story. Once upon a time, in the land of Israel, in the Judean hills, there was a group who got together and said, you know, there are these guys I met the other day who came up from Egypt, and what a story they had. Let me tell you all about it. And they started telling the stories of the Exodus of Egypt. And then they started telling stories about, you know, let me tell you about how this whole world came to be. And they started telling stories of creation. And they started telling stories about all different kinds of tales of this family that everyone in the Judean hills said, you know what, like that kind of feels like my family. And they eventually, very sadly, were kicked out of those Judean hills and of Jerusalem in the year 586 BCE by the Babylonians. Okay? They were sent into Babylonian exile, and they said, you know, it might be a good idea to start writing some of these down because they are important to us. They're our national treasures. And so people started writing down stories of the Hebrew Bible. There is a very prominent, popular theory, hypothesis, especially, to the scientists in the room, a hypothesis called the documentary hypothesis, which posits that there were four main authors of the Hebrew Bible: J, E, P, and D. The Yahwist, this theory was developed in Germany, hence Yahwist for J for Yahwist, but the Yahwist, Elohist, priestly, and Deuteronomic, I don't even know what to call them, documents, basically, documents. And so, and eventually an anonymous collector or editor put it all together. And that is how the Torah came to be. Now, I just told you two very different stories about what it means, what Torah means. And I also want to highlight that last week, something we didn't get to cover in our textbook was an essay by Rabbi Rachel Timoner. And she talks about being commanded, about how if we as Jewish people understand ourselves to be commanded, who is doing the commanding and what does it mean to be commanded? The modern world has basically told us, I'm not really commanded to do anything, right? I don't have to be Jewish. I don't have to be anything. I can be what I want to be. And so that is what we are talking about right now. Where Torah comes from is one of the central questions of Judaism, and it will shape who you are as a Jewish person. Because if you understand the Torah to be given at Mount Sinai to Moses, who passed it on to Joshua, who passed it on to the elders, who passed it on to et cetera, that's a very different document than a bunch of guys in the desert around campfires writing stuff down, compiling it, and making it what it is. I'm going to stop there and see what kinds of questions you have. Also, I apologize. The first time I learned about that was in 10th grade, and I thought my head had exploded. Now, it's a different thing. I grew up in a Jewish day school and really never learned about that second story. So anyway, so happy to have discussions after that, you could potentially leave this and say, there's this rabbi who just told me God didn't write the Torah, blah, blah, blah. So, but I leave it to you. What questions do you have? What is this, what stories are you leaning towards? Maybe as an exercise, we can, oh no, that's all right. We'll leave it for discussion today. What are you thinking? John.
Rabbi, I guess it's a historical type question. What, or if you know, and I apologize if I'm putting you on the spot a little bit, when do we know the first, I guess you'd say, Torah in the sense where it's the scroll, the 5 books together? When is the earliest ones known to exist?
Great question, and don't worry, I'm prepared for this one. There'll be plenty, and I'll let you know when I'm not too. So up until the early 1900s, the oldest complete Hebrew Bible was from the year 1000 CE, Common Era. So not, compared to when this stuff was from, pretty late in the game. Until there was a shepherd, a teenage shepherd, who was playing around in a cave in the early 1900s. I'm sure some of you know this story and may have even seen some of it. And he found these gigantic clay cases inside a cave by the Dead Sea, which famously became known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. That pushed us back as far as an original document 1,000 years. It goes back to the time of pretty much the time of the turn of the millennium to the year 0. So what we actually have is our documents from there. They're still being studied, they're still being analyzed, and they are actually housed in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. So that's the oldest we have. We do find discrepancies between the 5 books of Moses that the tradition has said this is how you write it. There are differences in the text itself to what we have from 2,000 years ago. So we do know that that's the case. Now, someone who believes that this came down from God will easily say, don't worry, right? It was human error over time. That's what explains it, right? God had it one way and we humans, we imperfect humans kind of messed it up. But that's the line of where that is. So we do have ancient texts. Scholars believe we do not have, and this is why from when I mentioned the documentary hypothesis, we do not have, it's not a theory because we don't have the proof. We don't have the J document. No one's ever been in the desert and said, I found the Yahwist document. I found the Elohist document, yada, yada, yada. That's not there. We don't have that. So it's only a hypothesis. And scholars hypothesize that with a pretty good guess that the first Torah scrolls as we know it, the 5 books being done and set, was by about 500 BC. So, 500 before the Common Era. In the chat, do me a favor. Story 1, okay, story 1 will label as Torah at Sinai, passed down from generation to generation. Story 2 being a bunch of guys in the desert. Where do you lean? If you can, just put in the chat 1 for Torah from Sinai, 2 for, I feel like I'm on a telethon here, right? Press 2 if you'd like, okay, and 2 if you think that this was a collective document in the history of humanity. Okay, so yes, please. All right, you guys are seeing what I'm seeing, right? It's interesting to see, and makes a lot of sense.
Would it be fair to say that Orthodox might be putting more 1s up there or not? We're Reformed. Would the Orthodox lean a different way? I tend to think yes, but in this respect.
It's a wonderful question. It's a wonderful question. Okay. All right, and we have a house divided in the Shore household. That's great. Okay. I'm glad. Okay. So, wow, lots of 2s. Okay. So this is actually where, and I want to I think we're purposely taking a detour. I want to spend, if someone can actually time me, let's spend 15 minutes, okay? Until 8 o'clock, let's talk about what this means, right? And then at 8, I want to push us forward because there's actually so much more Jewish text. But I think this will lead us back into that conversation. What I want to highlight for you, if I can remember what I was going to say. Okay, I got it. All right. So so first of all, we can't anymore say the Orthodox, right? And especially for those of you who are taking this class for the first time, right? Like being or encountering Judaism for the first time. This is the Jewish people have a right to it all, right? And the Reform movement in particular prides itself on being a big tent Judaism, which means that if you walked in and said, I believe God gave the Torah to Moses at Sinai, right? My answer is, awesome. Tell me more about that, right? Because that's what this is about. It's belief, and cultivating identity can come in so many different forms, okay? And I will tell you that there are many Orthodox rabbis in the world today who would say, right, if you went to them and said, I don't believe that the Torah was written on Mount Sinai, right, or given at Mount Sinai, they would say, awesome, tell me more about that, right? I think there isn't a challenge to progressive Judaism where we think, oh, the Orthodox, right, they do things differently than us. They're a different breed, right? I would say, my opinion is that they would have a more nuanced answer to what it means that God gave the Torah at Sinai. They won't reject it. I would say most Orthodox Jews will not reject that that's true, but they might have a different understanding about what that actually means, right? What did it mean that God gave Torah at Sinai, et cetera, et cetera. I want to highlight for you another reference that that you can take a look at. This is the Torah.com. The Torah.com started, I believe, a few years ago. It's gotten a lot of criticism from the Orthodox world. But this is all Jewish academic scholars who live Orthodox lives. They are members of Orthodox synagogues. They live in the Orthodox world, and they are deeply committed to biblical scholarship as defined in the academy. So if you're looking for the tension there between what goes on, here it is, okay? And they have, I mean, we're not going to go too deep into this, but they have a whole thing on, what is biblical criticism, modern faith, right? All of these different things, and they talk a lot about the project of this site and what it is. Stop my screen share. Now, the other really important thing is, as much as we in this group here might say, oh, the Orthodox, they believe it was all written at Sinai, there's certainly a lot from the Orthodox side of things to say, the Reformers, they don't know anything, right? They all think that this is written from chicken scratch in the desert, right? And that is also not true, right? I gave you a binary, right? I said pick one or two, chocolate or vanilla, right? And I did that on purpose because, I wanted to get you engaged in some way. But I will tell you this, most of us, I would imagine, even if you think you're on one extreme or the other, probably live somewhere in between, right? Life is gray. Life is not, it happened this way or this way, and that's it. I will tell you, and again, I feel a little out of place saying this because there are people in higher education here, but in the academy, right, scholars are limited sometimes. They have to be limited because a scholar writing an academic paper of religion cannot say, and this is where God stepped in and did it, right? Because go prove it, right? You can't, it's not a scientific, methodologically sound way of explaining something. So scholars of religion are going to have to really do either some mental gymnastics, right, to live in both worlds, or they'll have to, and this is what I love coming back to, or they'll have to struggle with it, okay? They'll have to struggle with text. They'll have to be able to say, what does this mean to me? And probably in different rooms at different times, talk about it in different ways. And I will say, that very much describes my relationship with Jewish text, because some of these texts, I will say, pardon, my kind of disdain, but there are some texts in the Torah that make me want to puke. Okay, there is God-sanctioned genocide in the Bible. Take the example of the Amalekites, right? If I come across an Amalekite baby, according to the Hebrew Bible, I should kill it, right? Not exactly what I want to do. When Noah, right, is told, God says, I'm going to flood the whole world and kill everyone, but I'm saving you. And Noah says, good deal. When do I start building, right? That's theologically and ethically very problematic, right? Our text is basically begging us to struggle, to grapple with this stuff. And that happens in so many ways in Jewish history. And what I love, and why I'm asking you to stop me at 8 on this discussion, is because where we're going next is Jewish text is all about struggling with Torah. It's all about struggling with text. And we're going to see that as we move forward in the text itself. Okay? So I'll stop there again. Questions, thoughts, anything that's coming up? Show of hands if you agree, disagree, or no, wait, that's too many options for just a show of hands. Show of hands, do you, have you been surprised by anything I've said tonight? Okay. All right, good. I hope you will leave this class with more questions than answers. I just want to throw that out there. I'll share the story that when I went into the Jewish Theological Seminary. Oh, I almost forgot. I have to give you my bio. I realize I'll do that in a minute. Like, you should know who I am and where I mean, I know I told you my name, but like, who am I? Am I, where did I learn all this stuff from? But at the Jewish Theological Seminary, little hint in my bio, I learned from Rabbi Gordon Tucker, who taught a course on theodicy, which is the defense of God in the face of evil. Okay, and his opening line in the class was, "If you're here looking for answers, you're in the wrong place." Right? That basically saying we don't know why bad things happen to good people, and we're going to study what other responses have been throughout history, other people's answers, but ultimately we just don't know. And I was like, all right, well, that's going to be a frustrating class, right? Like, because I wanted to know. I want to know, like, what are the secrets of the world? And this takes us back to text, because there is a belief, okay, I would say across the board in Judaism, that if we keep studying the text, that all we need is in it. Okay, there's a famous line from the Talmud. I'll go into what that is in a moment. Hafochba de kulaba. Read it, turn it over, for everything is in it. And so the idea being that if I just keep studying this text, if I keep pouring my soul into it, it's going to give gifts that are amazing. And I would say from personal experience, I have found that to be true. Granted, I'm biased being a rabbi, but I will tell you, I gained so much from looking at the text and grappling with it. Not just seeing it and saying, oh yeah, that's, right, this story again, not memorizing it, but really wrestling with it. And it can lead to a lot of meaning. So really, actually, I will tell you that it is Jewish text that got me to where I am today. I grew up on Long Island. I think that much I told you last time. I went to Jewish day school from K to 8, from kindergarten to 8th grade. I was very interested in playing baseball, of all things. So instead of continuing on at a Jewish day school where I was learning Hebrew and English, I went to public high school. I played baseball. It's a good move. We went to the New York State Finals my senior year. Glad I had the experience. Got to college with an 8th grader's theology of the world, okay, because I left religious study after 8th grade, and a whole lot happens, as I'm sure you know, between 8th grade and college. Started taking religion classes because my life experience did not match what my 8th grade teachers taught me about the world, and wound up studying Jewish text I thought about law school like when I entered college, and left as a double major in history and religion studies. Went on to do a master's at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, and then found my way to rabbinical school. I took a year off and was a personal trainer for a year in Manhattan. That was a lot of fun. And then after that, went to rabbinical school in at Wingcoat at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. And from there, went out to Tempe, Arizona for 3 years and had a wonderful experience learning how to be a rabbi as a rabbi educator. And me and my whole family being from the East Coast, came back, and here I am at Congregation Beth Or, which has nothing to do with Torah, but everything to do with who's teaching you about Torah. So, so anyway, that's me in a nutshell, and that is the Torah in a nutshell, or at least in what we can do in one class session. I want to let you know a couple of things, and then I'll open it up for questions again. Number one, every Saturday morning we have Torah study. And this is actually a good, here at Congregation Beth Or, this is a good springboard into the next part of this class. Why? Because we don't always study the Torah. And this is another thing that I want to highlight. Torah has a root of yoreh, of shooting, and it basically means teaching, okay? It is a teaching, and in different parts of the Hebrew Bible, it says Zot Torat Moshe, which actually pretty much means, right, that middle word there, Torah, in there, it means this is the teaching of Moses. So when we talk about Torah study, we always have to ask, are we talking capital T Torah or small t Torah, right? And ultimately, there's so much text out there, so many opinions and ideas, that basically what you've got is a whole lot of a whole lot of stuff to study, but every single week, the Torah is read in synagogue, one portion a week with some breaks for holidays. And every year we read the same cycle. And all of you are more than welcome to join us on Saturday morning for Torah study at any point. And also, that's pretty much it. So if you want to dive deeper into what Torah is, there are ways to do that. And of course, writing to me, having discussions with me, that is all possible. Ooh, so much to cover. All right. So let's pause here. Questions, concerns, comments. What do you got for me? Or just we got one. All right, Brian, go ahead.
I apologize. You may have said this, but what is the origin of the second story? Like where did that come from, I guess?
Fantastic. I made it up. No, okay. So story 2, right, is basically the assumption that actually began in the 1800s. There's a gentleman by the name of Julius Wellhausen, okay, who actually began, he was a German scholar, German biblical scholar, and actually started his work on the New Testament, the Christian Bible, and started tracing, right, where all of these things came from. I'm a bit out of my lane here talking about the New Testament, but from what I understand, the idea that the entire New Testament is the Word of God is actually a late development in Christianity and Christian thought, and so it wasn't as crazy of an idea to trace, like, where did all of these things come from? And he started looking for linguistic clues, and ideas about, well, where did all of these texts come from? And it was a tremendously successful project. So what did they do? They said, I wonder if we could do the same thing in the Hebrew Bible. And so let me show you. So we are going to, let me take you to the opening line of Genesis. And this is going to be, of course, a very rudimentary explanation, but such is life, and we can go into details. Welcome to the very beginning of Genesis 1, Genesis 1:1, where it all began. Okay, I'm going to make this a little bit bigger so we can all hopefully see it. The Torah begins. Breshit bara Elohim et hashamayim et haaretz. When God began to create heaven and earth. By the way, translation, right, is always going to be interesting for one reason or another. This one, for whatever reason, has, and this is the JPS, the Jewish Publication Society translation, I believe from 1985 that they're using. Don't be that impressed. It's not like I knew that just from this. I just happened to look it up. So, you know, of course, a lot of us know the in the beginning, right? But here they've chosen not to, but it's still the same Hebrew, Bereshit, in the beginning, bara, created, and then this word here, Elohim, God. This is the Hebrew word for God, but so are a lot of other ones. So when I talked about the documentary hypothesis, this is one of the key words that we're looking at to say, this is telling us something, that there was a group of people who were writing this story that we find in the beginning of Genesis, where it says, bara Elohim, that Elohim created the world. We're going to call, any time that it refers to that, we're going to call it the Elohist document, based on that word of God for Elohim. I'm going to skip up top here. Let's go to Genesis chapter 2. After the story you're likely familiar with of, on the first day God created this, second day, third day, fourth day, blah, 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 right? We get a sudden new story. Chapter 2, Genesis chapter 2, verse 4. Such is the story of heaven and earth when they were created, when the Lord God made earth and heaven. Okay, we look to the Hebrew. Ele toldot hashamayim ve'haaretz behibaram. Okay, which means such is the story of heaven and earth when they were created. Beyom asot, that is another huge important word. Is everyone seeing this okay? I hope you are. This is the 4-letter unpronounceable name of God. Okay, and this is what German scholar Julius Wellhausen called Yahweh, the Yahwist document. It's also where the term Jehovah comes from. Okay, but in Jewish tradition, we don't even try and pronounce this word. Instead, we say Adonai. Beyom asot Adonai Elohim eretz v'shamayim. So what Wellhausen is saying is, even though it's in the middle of a chapter, chapter 2, verse 4, this is a totally different story. All right, I'll stop my share. That's a totally different story. And there's linguistic cues to show that it came from somewhere else. That's the beginning, that academic rigor of looking at the text and saying, wait a minute, if God is referred to this way here and this way here, and there's other potential contradictions, such as in the first story, vegetation appears long before humanity does, but then in the second story, I'll share my screen one more time, just because I can't resist pointing this out. So in the second story, all of a sudden, we see something very different. We see in the next line, when no shrub of the field was yet on earth and no grasses of the field had yet sprouted, because the Lord God had not sent rain upon the earth and there was no man to till the soil. So what do we get from just that one line? Wellhausen and his colleagues are going to say, whoa. This is a different story written by an agrarian society where all of a sudden the soil is such a big part of it. And they're referring to God as a different name. And they've got, and they're talking about there's no shrubs on the field. What do you mean? I just read in Genesis 1 that shrubbery was all done and there was a whole garden there, right? Like, what do you mean, right? And so there's really a lot of different takes on this where some people would look at it and say, this is clearly an editing job. One thing I want to highlight about the editing job is that we can't assume that people in the ancient world were stupid, right? They just, well, I guess you could, but I don't. And I learned from my history professor in college not to. The idea is that they were clearly comfortable with some contradictions staying there in a way that we're not, right? We open up a book, right? And we know that the Hebrew Bible did not start as a book. It started as a scroll, right? The Codex comes much later. But ultimately, even our expectations about how a story should read and that it should all be seamless, clearly not the case for the biblical authors or for the biblical author, right? That we can find contradictions. And what I love about Torah study is that I could come from our binary of, I'm in camp number 1. God wrote the Torah, God gave it to Moses, and I see contradictions, okay? And person number 2 says, I think a bunch of guys in the desert wrote this. We can still debate and we can still have meaningful conversation. We just differ of where it comes from. But ultimately, person number 1 with the Sinai story is going to say, yes, God wants me to see this as a contradiction, but I know that it is perfect. And it's my human mind that just isn't understanding the depth yet of why this makes sense. Person number 2 is going to say, I see a contradiction here. And the editor, right, wanted to highlight that these 2 different folks in 2 different areas of the desert, they had such inspiration, but they were, felt the presence of God, but they were expressing it in different ways. How come, right? And that's where the story begins, right? Our story of our relationship to the Hebrew Bible and where it goes. Nobody stopped me at 8 o'clock. It's 8:03. Come on, everyone. I'm just kidding. All right. So let's stop there. Like any questions anyway, I'm sorry. I should ask Brian, did I answer your question? Is that helpful?
Yes, thank you.
All right. And I would say, as much as I'd love to say, well, there are some Orthodox Jews who think this, and John is right. I think, John, coming back to your question, yes, in general, if you think God wrote the Torah on Mount Sinai and gave it to Moses, right, you probably have a different approach to what the Torah means and what it should mean in your life. Okay, and so yes, that might lead to an Orthodox lifestyle, whereas Reformed Jews, if we are going to embrace the idea of that Torah is ever evolving, that it's a document that is to be understood and reinterpreted, then yes, then I can reinterpret it as well, right? And make meaning of it in my life and continue forward with it, still in conversation with it, but in a way that I am, as Mordechai Kaplan famously said, that the past has a vote, but not a veto in the way I live my life. And that's a key phrase for, I would say, for religiously progressive Jews who are not going to say, the tradition says this, so I must obey it, or else, whatever that or else is. So I wish we could spend the next 18 or 16 or 17 classes or however many classes we have on this. But I want to move us forward a bit because there's so much more to learn, okay? I'm going to go back to our screen share. And I'm going to take us back to Safaria. And hopefully find our way. Okay. So, oh wait, I got to go back even one more. All right. So I just, hopefully in some kind of sufficient way, explained what the Tanakh is, the Hebrew Bible. Okay. Then there are 2 more terms that I'm going to introduce to you. One is Mishna and one is Talmud. Okay. The Mishna is actually is an earlier text that is encompassed in the Talmud. The Mishnah are the writings of rabbis from the years 0 to 200, roughly, written in rabbinic Hebrew, and they are interpretations and teachings based on the Hebrew Bible, based on the Tanakh. The Talmud takes the Mishnah and expands upon that. We know it's a later document because instead of writing in Hebrew, they are writing in Aramaic, commenting on ancient Hebrew text of the Mishnah. Okay. The Talmud is one big argument. It is rabbis going back and forth about what does this mean? What does that mean? What does this mean? What does that mean? Let me give you an example. The first, it's too much to even worry about. We'll click on it, right? This is the very beginning of the Talmud. Me'ematai korin et shma ba'aravim. The beginning of tractate, oh, okay, oh, great. So, okay, so one of the things, the William Davidson Talmud does a wonderful job adding a lot of extra words to help explain what this is. It does not read like a novel, okay? So anything that you see unbolded, anything unbolded is actually explanation by the translator. Then you get to the bold, which is the actual words that are being translated. So I'm going to stick with this for now. I'll add my, my little interpretation. Mishna. So it starts with not the right. It's part of the Talmud, but they're providing for us this teaching. From when does one recite the Shema in the evening? Okay. So it's then going to say from the time when the priests enter to partake of their truma, which is here they'll explain it. Oh no, they won't. So truma is it's when they eat their dinner, basically. Okay. Until when does the time for the recitation of the evening Shema extend? Until the end of the first watch. Okay, and they cite, and this is key, they cite Deuteronomy 6:7. All right, I'm going to stop my share. So it says in the Torah, in one of the most famous lines in the Ve'ahavta, okay, which is a prayer that is said traditionally by Jews when you lie down and when you rise up. Okay, it says, Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, you should love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. Okay, Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha. Okay. You shall teach them to your children. You shall and tell it to them. Beshivtecha beveitecha, when you're dwelling in your house. Uvlechtecha baderech, when you are walking along the way. Uvshochbecha uvkumecha, when you lie down and when you rise up. Okay. Beautiful words, beautiful liturgy. We say it all the time in Jewish circles. The Talmud's job is to say, okay, I'm supposed to say these words when I rise up, when I go to bed and when I rise up. Which words? It doesn't explicitly tell me in the Torah. When do I go to bed? If I take a nap in the afternoon, do I have to say these words? If I get up in the middle of the night because I have to go to the bathroom, do I have to say these words? What does this mean? What does the Torah mean? Okay, and this goes back to John's point at the beginning, right? They also, okay, are going to derive different laws from Torah. And the line I gave you before, hafoch ba dekula ba, turn it over, for everything is within it. The rabbis of the Talmud took that seriously. They believed that if they read it enough and if they interpreted the words enough, we would have an answer. And so I get to the first of, God willing, many times where I get to tell you a joke. Okay, so Moses is up on Mount Sinai. I'm sure some of you likely have heard this before. Moses is up on Mount Sinai, and God says, Moses, do not cook a kid in its mother's milk. A kid being a baby goat. Okay, not a different kind of joke. Okay, so God says, Moses, do not cook a kid in its mother's milk. And Moses says, okay, so you want us to not have cheeseburgers. And God says, Moses, do not cook a kid in its mother's milk. And Moses says, oh, okay, so you mean you want us to have separate dishes for meat and dairy? And God says, Moses, do not cook a kid in its mother's milk. And Moses says, I understand. You want us to wait 6 hours between eating meat and dairy. And God says, Moses, do whatever you want. Okay. like everything, there's a lot of truth in a joke. And like every rabbi, I have no shame of telling corny ones. So, so here's what I want to share with you. The truth in that joke is that the only thing it says about the mixing of milk and meat in the Torah is do not cook a kid in its mother's milk. If I were to take that literally, what does that mean? It means if I'm on a farm and I have a goat, right, a kid, I can't cook it in its mother's milk. But if my neighbor gives me milk, then I'm fine. And if I have a cow in my goat milk, I'm fine. And if I eat a cheeseburger, I'm fine, right? The Torah is very specific about what should be eaten. Now, there's other biblical kosher laws. No seafood, no at least shellfish or things like that. No pigs, right? The most famous one. No pork. But as far as all of these other laws of what we as Jews in the 21st century understand as kashrut, as keeping kosher, it comes from later interpretations of the Torah. Now, this is where we see differences in Jewish tradition, because there are some people who believe that everything was given at Mount Sinai, not just the Torah in those 5 books, and not just the Torah in a scroll, but all of the commentary to come, that Moses was the greatest teacher of all time and took all of it in, every single part of it, and spit it out for generations to come until it got written down. Or I would say the more religiously progressive way to look at this is to say, the Torah says this, and the rabbis took that to mean something else. How come? Why? What did they see in it? And if they've changed things, why can't I? And that sets off the modern interpretation of what progressive Judaism is, this idea that Judaism has always been changing. It's always been grounded in Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible, but where it goes is going to be up to the people who carry the tradition, the people carrying the books, and the people who are telling the story. One more thing I'll add to this before I open it up for discussion is something really, really crucial when it comes to the actual giving of Torah from one generation to the next, which is that each generation gets to decide what stories to tell. There is a whole discussion in the Talmud about which books should be in or out of the Hebrew Bible. We know that there are things like Apocrypha. There are books that didn't make the cut for one reason or another. Most famously is that the Jewish people do not have the books of the Maccabees in our Hebrew Bible. It's just not there. The rabbis of the Talmud had a little bit of a gripe against the Maccabees. They really hated them, actually, and said, no, they're not being included in the text. In fact, the letters that you saw so beautifully written back there are letters from the Aramaic language, not from ancient Hebrew. Ancient Hebrew coins have a whole different alphabet, and the rabbis of the Talmud said, I hate those guys, those Maccabees. We're changing the script, literally. And so they have, and so there's a lot of changes that have happened. So what we see often as like from the very beginning, history tells us might not be the case. It is our job to wrestle with it, to study it, to love it, right? And to love the struggle of it. And that is what Jewish tradition, I think, has always been about, is about those struggles. I'll say one more thing about this, that many times in the Talmud, I'll start here. The modern word for a tie in a soccer game, and I use soccer not because I love it as much, but because it is the big sport in Israel, is teko. And it comes right out of the Talmud, and it's actually an acronym for Tishbi Taretz Kushiot Uchuvot, which translates to the Tishbi, meaning Eliyahu, Elijah the prophet. When he comes, he's going to answer all questions and problems. So why is that a tie? because in the Talmud, you find these unresolved arguments, okay? Or, you know, in the Talmud, your dinner table, whatever it might be in the Jewish tradition, right? You have, in the Torah, you have in the Talmud, excuse me, you have unresolved arguments that basically it just stops and says, it's a tie. We'll wait for Elijah to come and answer these questions. We don't know what to tell you. And it is such an amazing thing, right? That a religious text would say, we don't know, right? Or it's interpreted two different ways. And that is where I think I want to leave you with tonight. That's what I want to share with you, is that Jewish studies and text is about wrestling with it, arguing with it, and at the end of the day saying, right, being humble enough to say, we're not quite sure. We're not quite sure where this all started, but we know it's so important to the Jewish people. That's a little bit of editorializing as well. I want to be clear about that, right? There are plenty of rabbis who will tell you, you know, it came from Sinai, every word is perfect. And, you know, and I think it's my training in both academic institutions and in progressive Jewish rabbinical, you know, progressive rabbinical schools that get me to that explanation of what the miracles of text, of Jewish text are. I did a lot of talking tonight. I apologize that this was mostly a frontal presentation, and I hope that next week we'll be back to doing things. I will share with you that one of the things we do or when I'm in person, I just couldn't figure out how to do it like this, was I pass around different texts from different time periods, and then I have us like do it in a big circle, and I'm sorry I couldn't get it tech ready for our Zoom class. But one day, God willing, we'll all get together and study some text in that way. So I will stop talking. John, I see your hand up, and I'd love to hear other thoughts, comments, and questions as well.
One thing that came to my mind in what you were discussing there, obviously, in a sense, there's an awful lot of it that kind of seems to be up for debate or can be debated about. But are there anything that kind of maybe would qualify as core tenets, things that in Judaism they would say, these, other than I guess you could say God, Torah, Israel, that are not, that people just don't argue about? They say, okay, these are those pillars, that foundation, and these are the things that we build upon and don't argue about.
There is a group in America and in Israel called the Shalom Hartman Institute. It is an organization committed to Jewish pluralism, and they did a study just last year. In fact, the Board of Rabbis, Philadelphia Board of Rabbis, welcomed a gentleman by the name of Dr. Yehuda Kurtzer, who he's the North American president of the Shalom Hartman Institute, and came and presented on Jewish pluralism. They found one thing, literally, that Jewish people across everything do not argue about. Do I have any guesses? They literally found one thing. So it's actually it's a sweet one. It's a good one. Disabilities inclusion. They found that is the one thing that across every denomination, everyone's on board. Anything else, including God, Torah, and Israel, there's a whole lot of debate.
Okay, so it's a start.
I think it's a good start. But truly, I mean, you know, pick anything, really. I mean, you know, to answer a little bit more, pick anything, right? God, I mean, is God a man? Does God have a gender? Can God act in the world? If God acted in the world, why did the Holocaust happen? You know, and we'll actually address some of these. Israel. Where is Israel? Where are the borders of Israel? Should the modern state of Israel exist? Right? Even that, you have ultra-Orthodox sects of Judaism who say until the Messiah comes, the modern state of Israel is a no-no. So you have plenty of anti-Zionist Jews in the world. I mean, not a ton, probably accounting for like 2 or 3%, but they're there. And some of them, ironically, live in an ultra-Orthodox section of Jerusalem called Mea Shearim, where they don't pay taxes and they refuse to do anything related to the government, but they're living on the land because they believe it's the land that God gave to the Jewish people. So, even so, and Torah, right? I mean, we just spent this class talking about it, right? You tell me what it means. There's no one way of seeing any of this. And as we talked about last time, there is also no centralized authority, right? There are plenty of people throughout Jewish history who have claimed to be the central authority, to say, I'm going to tell you all how to do it. And everyone else kind of said, thank you, appreciate the advice, right? Like nobody's going to say that you are right, or one person is going to decide what Judaism means for all of us. Pearl, I saw that you had your hand up. I just got to unmute. Oh, yeah, I think I can do that for you.
No, I was
There you go.
going to, I was just going to say that what John was trying to get to, was there any specifics that everybody stuck to? But I know people who are involved in Orthodox communities, and basically all of them have rabbis that interpret their rules, quote unquote, differently. And so they're all Orthodox, they're different, groups, and each one is their own temple, and each rabbi interprets certain things in certain ways. Just the same as you go to a kosher butcher in New York, and he has all different kinds of ground beef. One is sanctioned by one rabbi that's Orthodox, and another one is by another rabbi. And so all of these things are supposedly acceptable, but only for that particular group.
Right, Pearl, it's a great point. So let me, just to, I know the internet connection was a little shaky. Yes, Pearl. And so basically what Pearl is saying is, in the Orthodox world also, a rabbi's decision, a rabbi's decision in the Orthodox world is binding, okay? So what does that mean? It means that if I ask and the rabbi says, this is what you have to do, that's what you have to do. And so a lot of times there's a joke of like, oh, I would go ask my rabbi, but I'm going to ask this one because I know I'll get the right answer, right? But so it depends on the person or the community, and certainly that is not the case anymore with all rabbis. For example, me, right? If you ask me a question and I give you an answer, it's a suggestion, it's not a mandate, and that is also different. Lynn, I see that your hand is up.
Yeah, I just had a question back to John's point. What about things like tikkun olam and mitzvot? Aren't they foundations that we can't really argue with, or are they really arguing about that as well?
Good question. And we're going to dive into this next time, right? So mitzvot. So those are two wonderful words to bring up in here, or three actually. Mitzvot is the plural of mitzvah. Mitzvah is a commandment, okay? Now, everything we talked about tonight, right? Mitzvahs are contingent upon or are hinged on what you think about the Torah, right? Are we commanded by God to, I'll give you an easy one. Are we commanded by God to not murder? I hope so, right? And that is absolutely a commandment in the Torah. It's a mitzvah that we shouldn't murder people. Are we commanded by God to not mix wool and linen? Okay, something called shatnez, and it stems from the priestly. It stems from the priestly laws about where they were obsessed with keeping certain things separate and ordered. It is one of the 613 commandments to not mix wool and linen in your clothes. And going back to Pearl's point about New York, You can go to a cleaners. You can go to certain cleaners in New York City where they will check for you whether your clothing has a mixture of wool and linen, because it is one of the 613 commandments not to. So there are questions about mitzvot. Which ones do we follow? Do we have to follow all of them? And who commanded them? Are they commanded by the Jewish people? Are they commanded by God? What does that mean? Tikkun olam is another beautiful one. Tikkun olam is the Hebrew word for fixing, or words for fixing the world. It comes from the Aleinu in the final prayer that we most of the time one of the concluding prayers of the services. In the part that most people just mumble by, it says Letaken olam b'malchut Shaddai, to fix the world in the kingdom, under the kingdom of God. And it is a beautiful, beautiful line. I will tell you that today, going into American politics, Jews who vote on the right, conservative, politically conservative Jews, accuse politically liberal Jews of using the term tikkun olam as a way of fixing, of just using a liberal agenda. Okay, at least for tonight, I don't mind going into politics, but with 2 minutes left, probably not the best idea to start now. But here's what I do want to say, that all that means, what that shows me is that we're not aligned on what it means to fix the world, right? And so there's even debate about that. Yes, I think we can all embrace those concepts that of mitzvot, of tikkun olam. But then the question becomes, what does that mean for you? And this is where, and I'm sorry that I will send you on your way tonight to wrestle with these questions, because ultimately, it's not going to be this course for me to say, this is what Jews do, right? Go do it. But what I want you to wrestle with, well, what is the Torah? What is Jewish text? Where did it come from? What do I believe about it? And we will come back and discuss it and debate it. And the same will be true for mitzvahs, and the same will be true for tikkun olam. Right? What does it mean to fix the world? Does God command me to fix the world? What is this all about? And ultimately, I would say the way we ultimately answer that, and this is what I think is a very Jewish response. What does this all mean? Live your life. And what I mean by that is your life is the answer to these questions. What you do to fix the world is how you answer the question, what does tikkun olam mean? Read the Torah, right? What is the Torah? It's the answer is going to be, are you going to write a dissertation on one word in the Torah, which people have done? Are you going to read it to your children? Are you going to put on a play about the Torah? Are you going to make YouTube videos about the Torah, right? There's so many options, and how you embrace this is going to make it your Judaism. It's going to make it how you live your life with meaning and with purpose. So that's, I'm sorry, that's a sermonette really more than anything, but that's what my hope is for you for this class, that we'll continue to ask these questions and not leave with many answers. All right, well, it's 8:30. So that actually, it's not a bad way to end. So here's what I want to tell you. I'm going to review this week. I will send, like I did last week, a summary of this class, which will include links and different ways to explore more. And I'm thinking this week, I'm going to give you an assignment, and in true, as I just described the rabbinate, you don't have to do it, okay? But it'll be an invitation to you to explore a little bit more about the Hebrew Bible, and maybe even pick one story that you might want to dive into, and we can talk about it next time. If you dove into a story, what did it mean to you, and where do you want to go from there? Okay, so I will put all that together. I will try and make next class less lecture style as well, but I felt like tonight I had to get a whole lot out there, so I just went for it. Everyone, have a great week, and I'll see you next week, okay? All right, and I did see, and I'm sorry, I did see there are some comments here. I'm copying and pasting everything in the chat so that I can get back to you with that as well. All right, and I'm around. I realized, so sorry, one other thing. If you need to go, go ahead. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to stay on here till 8:40. If people want to hang around and chat or ask more questions like after class, that's such a key part of, of in-class stuff that I'm here to chat for the next 10 minutes if you need me, and we'll go from there. So you can leave at your own leisure, and I'm around.
It's a great class. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Thank
Jason.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. Enjoyed it.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Rabbi, I'm going
Hello,
to
John.
I'm going to jump in here in the after discussion because
Yeah, absolutely.
one of the things I guess that was running through my head was actually, I guess, a good Jewish thing is a story, and the true one about a friend of mine who became Jewish, converted to Jewish very late in life, and one of the things that happened in his process of making this decision was he would say, I'm not interested in converting to anything. I'm not believing in religion. I don't believe in God. And they said, good news, you don't have to. And he's like, oh, well, then maybe I will convert. His wife was Jewish. But it seems to me that sort of in the actual process of conversion, and I'm asking, I guess, really, is in the process of conversion, do you have to acknowledge the existence of a God, the Jewish God, a God, some God? Or is it, can you actually convert and not acknowledge that?
Well, so I heard two questions there. I would say, do you have to believe in God? No. Believe in the Jewish God? No. Do you have to acknowledge God? Yes. I think, what you would get asked is, okay, you don't believe in God. I'll tell you a story, right? A student comes to the rabbi and says, Rabbi, I don't believe in God. And the rabbi says, tell me about the God you don't believe in. I probably don't believe in that God either. Right? So there is, I think you would, if you were, someone converting is going to have to explain, when you see the word God, what does that mean to you, right? What do you think that the Bible was trying to communicate? And then I would say the other big red line for Jews, and this is a function of where we live, our time and place, is that it's not so much about an affirmation of the God of the Hebrew Bible, but a rejection of Jesus, right? That's a deal breaker. If someone walks in and says, yeah, I believe in God, and that Jesus is his son and is the savior of the world, it's like, we really appreciate your theology. Yeah, not here.
Thanks for stopping by.
Exactly. Well, and don't forget, right, as you know, right, the Jewish people have always said, like, thanks for stopping by and come eat the bagels and lox, right? Like, it doesn't mean you're not part of us. It just means you don't want to, you don't meet the criteria, or it wouldn't be intellectually honest for someone who believes in Jesus to not believe, to be Jewish. But what I would say is, I've sat on plenty beit deans, like the court where the conversion happens, where we say, what does God mean to you? And they say, I believe it's the mystery of the world. That's very different than, like, I believe that God flooded the world, asked Abraham to kill his son, all that kind of stuff. So,
Right.
So yeah, I mean, it's right. I think if you're talking about, do I have to believe in an omnipotent God that controls the world, right? The answer is no, not necessarily to be Jewish.
Okay, that. I've always kind of wondered what would be the take on that. I always heard his story. I wasn't quite sure what maybe the other side. But you did raise a question and a thought that I did. When you mentioned Jesus, do Jews generally believe in the historical not the mythological version, Son of God and all that, but the historical existence of Jesus, or not. I just don't know.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, I think Jesus is a figure who, I mean, I know that there's scholarly debate on this, right? There's papers and books written about
Of
did
course.
exist, right? So in as much as that, Jews are all over the map, but there's nothing wrong with accepting that Jesus was a human being who lived on earth in Roman Palestine in the 1st century. That, yeah, I'm in that camp, right? Of course, I can't deny that history.
Okay.
I don't think he's the son of God, right? That's the line in the sand.
Right there. Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
the line in the sand. Exactly. Yeah. Pearl, go ahead.
I was never aware that there was a book suggested to buy for the course, because when I remember I never got that connection for the registration, so then I never got paperwork or any indicator. So if you could send it to me or put it on the synopsis of the evening at the bottom or whatever.
Absolutely. I will send it out for sure.
Okay, thank you.
You got it.
Thank you very much. Very good evening.
Thank you, Pearl. Good to see you.
Take care, Rabbi. I'm going to say goodnight as well. Move on to
All
other
right, John. All right. Good night. I'll talk to you soon. And thanks for the great questions.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it.
All right. See you soon.
Bye-bye.